in the heart of the royal city, where tall stone towers touched the sky and banners moved with the wind. There lived a princess named Ilara. Her beauty was known in every land. But what made her truly different was her bold spirit. She did not stay silent when she had something to say. She did not bow down when she felt something was wrong. She carried herself with pride, with strength, with fire in her voice. Some admired her courage, but many more feared it. The nobles whispered that she was too fierce. They said no man could tame her, no man could control her. They wanted a princess who would smile softly and obey. Ilara did not fit that picture, and because of this, one by one, suitors turned away. Inside the palace, her mother, the queen, worried. She wanted her daughter to be happy, but each time a man came to ask for her hand, it ended in silence or shame. Ilara would challenge him, test his words, and soon the suitor would find a reason to leave. Days passed, and then months, and still no one stepped forward to claim her hand. The people began to whisper that she would never be chosen. Yet Ilara did not let their voices break her. She stood tall, even when her heart felt heavy. She told herself she did not need their approval. But in the quiet of a chamber, when the candles burned low and the night was still, she sometimes wondered if anyone would ever truly see her for who she was. Far from the palace, beyond the wide fields that stretched into the horizon, there walked a man named Daniel. He was not a noble. He was not rich. He had been a soldier, fighting in a war that had taken years of his life. His armor was old, his boots were worn, and his hands carried the scars of battle. Daniel was not proud of glory, for he had seen too much loss. He carried his memories like stones, heavy and unshakable. When the war ended, Daniel had no place to go. He wandered from town to town, helping where he could, asking for little in return. One day, his path brought him close to the royal city. He had heard of the bold princess, though he had never seen her. The stories painted her as proud, fiery, and untouchable. Daniel listened, but said nothing. Stories, he knew, often carried only half the truth. The city was alive with sound and color when Daniel entered its gates. Bells rang, merchants shouted, children laughed in the streets. Yet in the heart of the city, the mood was different. The palace was preparing for a grand ceremony. Word spread quickly through the crowd that suitors from across the land were arriving once more to ask for the princess's hand. Many came dressed in gold, in silk, in fine jewels. Each believed he might succeed where others had failed. Daniel found himself drawn toward the palace gates, not as a guest but as a watcher. He stood among the crowd, silent, his eyes fixed on the tall marble steps. The sun struck the palace walls, turning them bright as fire, and in that glow, he saw her. Ilara walked into the courtyard with the grace of a queen and the strength of a warrior. Her silver dress moved with the wind, and her hair shone in the light. But it was not her beauty that caught Daniel's breath. It was her eyes. They were steady, unafraid, sharp as steel, yet carrying a sadness hidden deep within. One by one, the suitors stepped forward. They bowed, they spoke, they offered gifts and promises. Yet when Ilara's eyes met theirs, their courage faltered. Some stumbled over their words. Others turned pale under her gaze. A few made bold claims, but her quick reply cut through their pride, leaving them with nothing to say. And as the hours passed, man after man walked away. The crowd murmured. Some laughed, others shook their heads. The nobles whispered again that no one wanted the princess. But Daniel, standing far behind, did not laugh. He saw something the others did not. He saw a woman who stood alone, though she was surrounded by many. He saw her strength, but also her loneliness. As the last suitor stepped back in shame, a silence fell over the courtyard. Ilara lifted her chin, hiding the ache in her chest, and turned to leave. But in that moment, Daniel felt a pull inside him, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. He did not know why, but he knew he could not stand still. And so, while the court whispered and the people waited, Daniel began to move.
The courtyard was filled with silence. The queen sat on her throne, her face calm, but her eyes troubled. She had watched her daughters stand proud while each suitor failed. Some had been rich, others noble. but none had carried the strength to stand beside Alara. The queen knew the whispers would grow louder after this day. They would say her daughter was too wild, too proud, too unwanted. Alara felt those whispers like sharp stones pressing against her heart. She had told herself she would not care. She had promised herself their judgment would mean nothing. But as she stood there with every man turning away, she felt something inside her sink. She had given so much for her people, and yet she stood alone. The nobles gathered in the hall spoke in low voices. They did not hide their laughter or their smug smiles. One of them, a lord dressed in blue silk, leaned toward another and said that the princess would end her days alone. Another answered that perhaps she deserved it. Their words cut through the air, and though Alara kept her chin high, she heard every sound. Daniel stood among the common crowd at the edge of the hall. His armor looked plain compared to the bright silks and shining jewels of the suitors. His boots were worn from long marches, and his cloak was patched where fire had once torn it. He did not belong in such a place, yet he stayed. His eyes did not leave Alara. When the last suitor stepped back and the crowd began to murmur, Daniel's heart pounded. He had never thought himself a brave man, though he had stood in battles where swords clashed and arrows rained. Yet now, with nothing but silence filling the hall, he felt a different kind of courage rising in him. It was not the courage of war, but the courage of truth. He thought of the nights he had sat alone by the fire after battle, wondering if his life meant anything. He thought of the men he had lost, the faces he could still see in his dreams. He thought of how empty the world felt when no one truly saw you. And as he looked at Alara, he felt that same emptiness in her eyes. Without waiting for a reason to hold him back, Daniel stepped forward. At first, no one noticed. The crowd's attention was still on the nobles, whispering among themselves, but then the sound of his boots against the stone floor carried through the hall. People turned. Murmurs spread. Who was this man walking with such quiet strength? The guards tensed, ready to stop him. His armor was not noble, his face not known. He was no lord, no knight of the court. Yet he kept walking, his steps steady. The nobles laughed, some shaking their heads. One called out that the soldier must have lost his way. Another said the man must be mad. But Daniel did not stop. Lara turned when she heard the sound. She expected another proud lord, or another mocking voice. Instead, she saw a man unlike the others. His hair was dark, his face lined with the marks of travel and hardship. His armor bore scratches, not jewels. He carried no gifts, no promises, only himself. But his eyes held no fear. A moment, Alara felt her breath catch. No man had ever walked toward her like this. No man had ever dared without pride or fear. The hall grew quiet again as Daniel came closer, each step a challenge to every tradition that bound the court. The queen leaned forward, watching. The nobles frowned, unsure whether to laugh or to shout. Ach! But the soldier did not look at them. He looked only at the princess. Daniel stopped a short space away from her. The silence pressed down like a heavy weight. He could feel every eye in the hall on him, yet he did not falter, bowed his head, not as a man begging for favor, but as a man offering respect. Then he lifted his hand. Gasps filled the air. A soldier, a man with no name and no title, had dared to reach out to the princess. The nobles were furious. They muttered that it was shameful, that it was disgraceful. But none of their anger mattered in that moment. Alara's eyes widened as she looked at him. She saw no greed, no arrogance, no fear. She saw only honesty. The first time in years she felt her heart stir. She did not move yet, but she could not look away. The court waited, holding its breath. The bold princess stood facing the soldier, his hand offered, the air thick with silence. What would she do? What would happen if she took it? And as the hall trembled with tension, the story began to change. The hall stood frozen. Daniel's hand was still stretched toward the princess, and the silence around him was louder than any shout. The nobles whispered, their faces twisted with disbelief. To them, it was madness. How could a soldier, a man with no title and no land, stand where kings and lords had failed? Yet Daniel did not flinch. He stood steady, his eyes fixed on Alara, as if the crowd no longer existed. Alara looked at him. She saw the scars on his hands, the worn lines on his face, the way his armor carried the marks of a hard life. He was not dressed in silk or covered in gold. He was not polished like the men who had bowed before her. But he was real. His hand did not tremble. His gaze did not waver. In his silence, she felt something stronger than any speech she had heard from the proud suitors. The queen's eyes narrowed as she studied the man. She did not speak, but her gaze held questions. Who was this soldier, and why did he dare to step into her court with such quiet boldness? The guards shifted uneasily, unsure whether to pull him back or wait for the princess's response. The nobles began to laugh, their voices sharp and mocking. One said the princess had fallen so low that only a beggar soldier would want her. Another called Daniel a fool chasing a dream too high for his reach. Their voices filled the air, trying to crush the moment, but Daniel did not turn his head. His hand remained steady, his eyes only on Alara. Alara felt the weight of every eye in the hall pressing on her. She could feel their judgment, their scorn, their disbelief. For years she had stood strong, hiding the ache inside her heart. For years she had been told she was too fierce, too wild, too unwanted. Yet here was a man who stood without fear, who reached for her not because of her crown, but because of her. Her heart beat faster. She wondered if she dared to answer him. She placed her hand in his. The court would erupt. The nobles would be furious. The whispers would turn into storms. Yet if she turned away, she knew she would regret it. Something in Daniel's eyes told her this was no ordinary moment. This was a choice that could change everything. The queen's voice finally broke the silence. She spoke softly, but her words carried across the hall. She asked the soldier his name. Daniel lifted his head and answered simply. His voice was low but firm, carrying no pride, no fear. He told her he was a soldier, no more and no less. He had fought in the war. He had lost brothers, and now he had nothing but the strength still left in him. The queen studied him. She did not smile, nor did she frown. She only nodded once, as if testing the truth of his words. Then she turned her gaze to her daughter. The court waited. Lara took a breath, her chest rising as if the weight of years pressed against it. She looked at Daniel's hand. It was rough, scarred, worn from battles and labor. It was not the hand of a nobleman, but it was steady, honest, and waiting. Slowly, Alara lifted her own hand. The court gasped. Some nobles even cried out in shock. Her hand hovered above his for a heartbeat, and then she placed it in his palm, yet it shook the hall like thunder. Daniel's hand closed gently around hers, not with force, but with care. Their eyes met, and in that moment the noise of the court faded away. For Alara, it was the first time in her life she felt chosen for herself, not for her crown. For Daniel, it was the first time he felt seen beyond the scars of war. The nobles erupted in protest. They shouted that it was disgraceful, that a princess could not lower herself to a common soldier. Some demanded the guards remove him at once. But the queen raised her hand, and the hall fell quiet again. She did not speak yet, but her eyes remained on her daughter and the soldier standing before her. Alara held Daniel's hand firmly, lifting her chin as she faced the storm of voices around her. She was not afraid. For the first time in years, she felt free. Daniel did not release her, and together they stood against the sea of doubt and anger. What began as a single step forward had turned into something greater. The court did not yet know it, but history was already changing. The hall was alive with voices. Shouts of anger rose from the nobles, their faces red with rage. They could not believe what they had just seen. A soldier with no title and no wealth had dared to touch the hand of the princess, and worse still, she had accepted it. Their words filled the air, sharp and bitter, each one thrown like a stone meant to wound. Yet in the center of the storm stood Alara and Daniel, their hands joined, their eyes steady. The noise of the crowd did not move them. For Alara, this moment was not about the court, nor about the whispers that would spread across the land. It was about truth. She'd spent years being judged for her boldness, her fire, her unwillingness to bow. And now she stood beside a man who did not fear it. Daniel felt the heat of every gaze pressing against him, but he did not let go. His grip was firm but gentle, a promise that he would not abandon her even when the world shouted against them. He had faced the roar of battlefields, the screams of war, and the silence of loss. This hall, with all its anger, was nothing compared to what he had already endured. The queen rose from her throne. Her steps were slow, but her presence commanded silence. The shouting nobles lowered their voices, their anger turning into restless murmurs. She walked down the steps, her eyes fixed on her daughter and the soldier. When she stopped before them, the hall held its breath. Her gaze moved from Alara to Daniel. She asked her daughter if this was truly her choice. Alara's answer came without hesitation. She said yes. Her voice was steady, her shoulders strong. She declared that she would not be given to a man who feared her, nor to one who wanted only her crown. She would stand with the man who saw her for who she was. The queen listened, her face unreadable. Then she turned to Daniel. She asked him why he had come forward. His answer was plain. He told her that he saw a woman who had stood alone too long, a woman who deserved someone who would not run from her strength. He did not claim to be worthy. He did not ask for power. He only offered respect and honesty. The hall stirred at his words. Some scoffed, saying it was a trick. Others sneered, calling him a fool. But there were a few hidden among the crowd who felt a spark of admiration for the soldier's courage. The queen studied him for a long moment. At last she nodded. She said the choice belonged to the princess, and if she had chosen, then the court would honor it. Her words fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every corner of the hall. The nobles were furious. They cried out that tradition was being broken, that the bloodline was being stained. They demanded the queen reconsider. Alara did not release Daniel's hand. She turned to the nobles, her eyes blazing, and told them that tradition meant nothing without truth. She was not afraid to walk a path that was different, and she would not let fear chain her life. Daniel stood quietly at her side, saying no more. His silence was stronger than their anger. His presence spoke what words could not, that he would not leave her no matter the storm. The queen lifted her hand, and the protests fell into uneasy silence. She declared the gathering ended. She told the nobles that the matter was closed, that her daughter's choice would stand. With that, she turned and returned to her throne, her decision final. Alara and Daniel stood together, their hands still joined. The nobles glared, the crowd whispered, but for the first time in years, Alara felt free. The court could not take this moment from her. She had chosen, and she had been chosen. As they left the hall, the murmurs followed them like shadows, but Alara did not look back. Daniel walked beside her, his steps calm and steady. Outside, the sun shone over the city, and the air felt lighter than the heavy silence of the court. For both of them, the future was uncertain. The road ahead would not be easy, but as they walked out together, hand in hand, they felt something stronger than doubt. They felt hope. The palace gates closed behind them, but the sound of voices still echoed in the distance. Alara and Daniel walked side by side through the courtyard, their hands still joined. The weight of what had happened inside the hall was heavy, but neither of them let go. The sunlight spread across the stones, and for the first time in many years, Alara felt warmth not just on her skin but in her heart. The city beyond the palace was alive with people. News of the strange and daring moment had already begun to spread. Merchants left their stalls to speak in low voices. Children whispered and pointed as the princess walked past, not with a noble lord or a man dressed in gold, but with a soldier whose armor bore scars. Some smiled in secret admiration, while others frowned and shook their heads. Daniel felt the eyes on him, but he did not look away or drop her hand. He had faced worse than stares. He thought of the lives he had lost in battle, of the weight of silence he had carried for years. And he knew this was worth more than the fear of gossip. Beside him walked a woman who chose him not because of his rank, but because of his truth. Alara held her head high as she walked, though her heart pounded. For so long she had been unwanted by the men who feared her strength. But today, for the first time, someone had stepped forward not to change her, not to silence her, but to stand with her. She felt a freedom she had never known. When they reached the edge of the courtyard, Daniel stopped and turned toward her. He looked at her as if the world had narrowed to only the two of them. He told her that the road ahead would not be easy. The nobles would resist, the whispers would grow, and the court would not forget. He asked her if she was ready for such a storm. Alara smiled softly, the fire in her eyes shining brighter. She told him she had faced storms all her life. She had stood alone when everyone turned away. If she could survive that, then she could survive anything with him by her side. Their words were simple, but in them was a promise of loyalty, of courage, of walking together no matter how rough the path became. Days turned into weeks, and the story of that moment in the hall spread across the kingdom. Some mocked, others admired, but no one forgot. The tale of the soldier who reached for the princess's hand and of the princess who took it became a story told in markets, in inns, and in quiet homes. It became a story of hope, that love and truth could rise above pride and tradition. Inside the palace, the queen watched her daughter with careful eyes. At first, she wondered if her choice would bring ruin. But as the days passed, she saw how Alara stood taller, how her smile returned, how her spirit grew even brighter. And she saw how Daniel walked with steady calm, not seeking power, not seeking fame, but always near, always honest. Slowly, even the queen's doubts began to fade. The nobles still resisted. They whispered in corners. They plotted in silence. But their words grew weaker as the people outside the palace began to admire the soldier who had dared what no noble could. Some said it was madness. Others said it was destiny. But none could deny the bond that had been formed. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Alara and Daniel stood on the palace balcony. The sky burned with shades of red and gold, and the wind carried the sound of distant bells. Daniel looked out at the city and said he never thought his life would lead him here. Had been only a soldier, wandering without a place. Yet now he stood beside the princess, chosen not by accident but by truth. Alara turned to him and said that it was never about titles or crowns. It was about seeing what others could not. She told him that when he walked across the hall, she saw more courage in him than in all the nobles combined. They stood together as the night came, the stars lighting the sky. Their hands remained joined, a simple gesture, but stronger than any crown or jewel. For in that moment, they knew that history would not remember the laughter of the nobles or the anger of the court. History would remember the courage of a soldier and the choice of a princess. And so began their new chapter, not bound by fear or tradition, but by respect, by honesty, and by love.